Nobody embodies the weight of experience and transformation quite like Heismay. A man shaped by years of isolation and grief, Heismay is the hardened elder of the group, jaded but undeniably wise. What makes Heismay so unique within the narrative is that his worldview is sculpted not only by isolation, but by a lifetime of being othered. Yet, as the game unfolds, Heismay undergoes a profound metamorphosis, challenging not only the protagonist's beliefs but also his own. His journey is not just about grief, it's about what comes after, the struggle to move forward, the tension between acceptance and resistance, and the possibility of rebirth. Through his relationships, his philosophy, and the painful choices he makes, Heismay becomes more than a mentor. He becomes the heart of the game's exploration of loss and redemption. Now, as many of you know at this point, I am the character analysis guy for this game that we love and cherish, Metaphor Refantatio. But if you're new here, just so you know, this analysis will be broken into 4 sections for ease of understanding. Heismay as an individual, his role in the story, his key relationships, and his hidden symbolisms. Let's head back to Uchronia and discuss. Heismay's depth makes him one of the most compelling characters in Metaphor Refantatio. His story is not just about grief, but about what comes after, how loss shapes us, how we struggle to move forward, and how understanding can bridge the deepest divides. His advanced age and wealth of experience makes him a figure of deep insight, yet his perspective is shaped by a lifetime of isolation and being looked down upon. This has left him slightly jaded, his worldview hardened by the circumstances of his upbringing. For example, I've seen that a lot of people are confused about Heismay's initial mindset earlier in the game, most notably his conversation with Juna, in which is revealed that he has a deep disdain of Parapis. Some people find these racist comments by Heismay out of place or perhaps unbefitting of a party member, but the writing here is actually awfully realistic, and I think it is brilliantly conveyed. Allow me to explain. Yes, as we know, Heismay's son died in a Parapis riot, but it's more than that. Let me draw a parallel to real life to sort of help to frame Heismay as a character. And please stick with me, as I think this is really valuable for understanding Heismay. I think we can all agree that scientifically, anecdotally, and from our own personal experience that our childhood and teenage years are formative years. The nurture and environment we grow up in determines a lot of who we end up becoming as adults. If you're raised by saints in a really great environment, you likely won't have a lot of internal deprogramming to do as an adult to become a good person who fits seamlessly into society. Though, of course, there are always exceptions and outliers. If you have a bad upbringing in terms of your parents and circumstances, then you will probably have more deprogramming to do in your adulthood than your peers to become a good person who fits seamlessly into society. Now, again, it is crucial to acknowledge that exceptions exist. Many people rise above societal conditioning, but it is also true that environments shape likelihoods. To briefly wrap this, I'm saying we can all agree that it is way easier to be a good, successful adult if you have a good childhood with a good environment. In other words, different people have different privileges and different belief systems that are instilled in them in their formative years. And depending on what those are, you will have more or less work to do as an adult to center onto a good path. Are you following? Let me explicate with a hypothetical. Imagine a man that is 78 years old today in 2025. Let's say this man was born to his parents when his father was 41, so pretty standard. That would mean we're talking about an adult now in 2025 who was born in 1946 and raised by a man who was born in 1905. So, in other words, this full 78-year-old adult now had his formative years literally before civil rights. Not only that, but he was raised by someone who had his formative years in the 1910s and 20s. This was a time frame where women couldn't vote, and the KKK literally had an estimated 3 to 6 million members. So this 78-year-old man, who probably has raised and guided multiple generations of children at this point and been a part of and possibly led multiple organizations, had his formative years in an environment where racism was the norm, and his main role model and influence was someone who had his formative years when racism was even more abundant and women couldn't even vote. Now, if you don't know, I'm American. And I won't get too deep into this, but there's a phenomenon in this country where there's a contingent of people who don't think racism exists now and that it only lives in the history books. Even if you ignore all of the blatant real-world examples that refute that, you could still glean from what I just went over that implicit racism is still pretty rampant in today's world. And that's completely logical if you consider how recently overt racism was the norm in this country and how our adults and elders are all raised by people whose formative years belong to that time frame. There is a lot of internal deprogramming that the vast majority of people need to do in this country in adulthood because of the environment everybody had, but Also because of the parents and nurturers that a lot of people had. Shit, I mean, I'm still in my 20s, so I'm a pretty young guy. My dad was born in 1953. Let me repeat that. I'm in my 20s, and the man who raised me and who I molded myself after was born before civil rights. I want everything I just covered to serve as the lens through which we view Heismay as an individual. Heismay is an old man. Yuji's are probably right below Elda as the most hated race in Uchronia due to them being the most different to others. They're nocturnal and possess distinct appearances that you'd more closely connect to a beast rather than the other races. Growing up, Heismay grew up in a mostly isolated village of Ujiv. He loathed how the village operated, as they relied on short-term alliances with other villages to keep afloat. In other words, they relied on the power of others and not their own. Heismay mentions that being a child, he escaped being convinced he was lesser and instead pursued honing his skills so that he may gain acceptance of the other races in the big city. His work bore fruit, and he was eventually able to leave his village and become a knight of the royal capital. Although he initially felt that he was finally accepted as equal by both his fellows and strangers, he eventually came to ascertain the falsity of that notion. You see, Heismay was only welcomed into the Knights so they could use him for the Shadow Guard, a unit that performed the dirtiest deeds that were kept secret. Eventually, Heismay drew a line, and in return he was stripped of his title. From here, everything snowballed, and the culmination was his son dying in a Parapet riot. To be clear, what increased the tragedy of this event was that his son died slowly, and had somebody tried to help him, he probably would have lived. But because he was just a Yujiv, the people ignored him bleeding out on the ground. I resurfaced those details so we can analyze how it all plays a role in Heismay's identity as an individual. In Heismay's formative years, both his environment and his nurturers conveyed to him both overtly and subliminally that he was lesser. It wasn't just the bold-faced standard racism, but also how the world reacted to Heismay when he worked hard and proved his worth. He only gained the perception of others once he became objectively great at something, but after that he was still cast aside and sent to the shadows, and this is all independent of his son's tragic death. So, to tie this back to my earlier points, Heismay, at the end of all of this, was faced with an inconceivable amount of deprogramming that would be necessary for him to functionally exist in society. We can say the root of Heismay's self-imposed isolation in that cave is grief, but I think that would be a disservice to the immensity of everything that he went through in his life. His son didn't just die, the world told him time and time again that both he and his son didn't matter. We have to place credence and emphasis on Heismay's status as an old man. Remember my example of a 78-year-old man in today's world. Heismay has simply spent more time stewing in the injustice of the world, and his formative years were also spent in a world with both people and environment more harsh than the current Uchronia world state, so he has far more work to do than the other characters to reform his identity into one that is worthy of being a model to others. I recently did a video in which I ranked every single awakening from both Persona 5 and Metaphor Rifantatio, and one of you said something to me that I found really profound and that I feel connects to this and captures the essence of Heismay. Let's take a look, guys, and Roxy, I really hope you don't mind me sharing and paraphrasing your comment. Roxy said, "I liked Heismay's Awakening a lot because I read it less as accepting your circumstances and more accepting your failings born from those circumstances. As someone who had an unfair lot in life, I felt the weight of my mistakes when I made them because I had no guardrails or safety nets to insulate me from the fallout. Then, even when I made it past the worst parts of those circumstances, it took a long time for me to let go of that guilt. It's easy to wallow in what ifs, but at some point you need to forgive yourself because self-flagellating doesn't do anyone any good, and there is plenty of good to be done out there." I believe this speaks to the quality and realism of Heismay's character that Roxy, myself, and I'm sure many of you can relate so strongly to him. While we might perceive his message in slightly different ways based on our life experiences, I believe Roxy put it best as they illuminated the idea of hardship and the struggle to move beyond it. The essence of Heismay comes down to forgiveness. We can forgive ourselves for things that lie out of our control while simultaneously striving to enact positive change and reform in ourselves as people. We can forgive the ignorance of others, the ignorance of our environments, while fighting like hell to unravel that ignorance. It's easier said than done, but this is part of what's so inspiring about Heismay. In spite of everything we've discussed, when the moment arrives and you enter his cave and speak with him, instead of trying to dispose of you to preserve his isolation, he holds back. and he willingly cooperates with you. In spite of his long, unfair life in which the world told him he didn't belong, in spite of the fact he feels he has nothing to live for, in spite of his immense guilt, tangled grief, he still has a fuse inside waiting to be sparked by somebody with the flame of hope and compassion. And you, of course, serve as Heismay's liberating flame. I think probably the best little detail to look at to see how much Heismay changes throughout the story is how in the epilogue he is placed with Basilio. They're clearly hanging out, and I believe this was a deliberate choice to convey to us that Heismay has grown beyond his hatred of Carapace and shed the ugliest part of his identity.
I am Heismay Noctul. I believe the arc of life depends not upon birth. By these hands, soiled or sinless, I fight!
Heismay's presence in the game is essential. In fact, without Heismay, the game would have ended about 15% of the way in, as there would have been no way to reach Joanna, who you'd likely be forced to kill, which would have left you with no way to get close to Luis. In fact, let's talk a little bit about that. I do believe that this is some of Atlus's best writing to date. Joanna has been committing arguably the worst crimes of anybody within Metaphor Refantatio's narrative. That, of course, being kidnapping innocent children and feeding them to a human that she has deluded herself into viewing as her own child. What led Joanna down this road was what happened to her own child. As you may recall, Joanna had a mixed child, and due to the old traditions, the people wrested her son away and put him to death simply for being mixed race. So Joanna has coped with her grief by viscerally taking her pain out on the world and disassociating to the degree that she refuses to accept that her child is truly gone and has fully convinced herself that the human is her child. Joanna juxtaposes brilliantly with how Heismay dealt with his circumstances because, as we know, Heismay retreated to a cave and withdrew from society with the hope that a monster would kill him eventually. So, in other words, the tragedy of their situations utterly broke them. But because they are both broken by such similar circumstances, once they encounter each other, their minds are able to coalesce and help each other finally grieve in earnest and begin the healing process. They share the burden. In spite of having every right to do so, Heismay does not condemn Joanna. Even though he was her main scapegoat, he chooses to instead connect and relate to her, and I'm not sure if Heismay would have made this decision prior to meeting you, and I feel he conveys as much when he says his eyes were opened by you and the party. Heismay's grace eventually drags Joanna back to reality, and ultimately she commits herself to helping you and your party. When she is killed for her crimes, she says to you that being able to confess was more than she deserved, and she accepts the consequences of her actions. We can glean from this that she was in all likelihood a decent person prior to what happened to her son, so I'd like to say based off of her arc and what Heismay himself goes through, I believe that one of Heismay's primary roles in the story is to showcase the transformative power of grief. He is meant to teach us very early in the game to view other characters in the story through a different lens. Luis has callous ideals and has caused the suffering of thousands, but he was irreparably transformed by what happened to him as a child. Hypholodius let the Sanctus Church run rampant in spite of his ideals of a world of equality. These two pillars of Uchronia were both transformed by grief, and that should inform how we view them as a player. Just like the example Heismay set, I believe we can commit to fiercely correcting them in their varying mistakes without completely condemning them. I think Heismay serves another key role in the story, and that is explicating to the player the difference between equality and equity. This is a concept I find many people struggle with in real life, to be honest. People think blanket equality would solve societal problems, but that largely isn't the case. What we should seek is equity. Heismay says it best when he says, "You cannot pretend at diversity without acknowledging our individual differences." And when he says, "Equal competition doesn't mean equal footing." Allow me to supplement this sentiment with the example of a classroom, as I believe most of us have experienced being in one at some point. Equality would be having a row of students all sit the same distance from the whiteboard or chalkboard. Equity would be having the students with the worst vision sit closer to the board. To give a Metaphor Refantatio example, let's stay in the classroom, but pretend we're in Uchronia. Equality is having a class where all races can attend that starts at 8 a.m. Equity is having two classes open to all with the same content, one that starts in the morning and one that starts at night, because Ujif are nocturnal and would be disadvantaged attending a class in the morning. So to at least provide them with the option of a night class would be equitable. To simply strive for equality and ignore their inherent differences would not. As an old man who belongs to the most uniquely distinct race, Heismay is best positioned to understand this concept more than most. And so he settles in seamlessly, almost as the dad of the group, who makes sure that you remain cognizant of catering your worldview mainly through empathy and not just through blind justice or a blind effort to do what you and you alone think is right for everyone else. Rather than simple camaraderie, Heismay constantly challenges beliefs and helps shepherd the group along the right path. Speaking of Heismay being the pseudo-dad of the group, let's chat about his key relationships within the story.
And you? Do you not condemn her? She kidnapped children, murdered them in cold blood, and would see you blamed for it.
In truth, I know this woman's pain all too well.
Huh?
In the name of her child, she was willing to turn against the entire world. Behind her atrocities, I see the devotion of a bereaved parent. You found yourself unjustly in a terrible darkness, and I struggle to blame you. Burying your own child is unbearable. Grief and madness fill the gaps where love had been. But my eyes were opened. These people helped me see. The only way to beat the darkness is to confront it. Step by meager step. You must walk back to our reality. Look upon that, and see true that it is not the child you once loved.
Part of why I appreciate the dynamic between the player character and Heismay so much is because oftentimes in storytelling, the elder statesman of the group serves to guide and inspire others to become the best versions of themselves and achieve success within the narrative. Think of Ben Kenobi and Luke Skywalker, or Harry Potter and Dumbledore, for example. The list goes on, but in this story, that trope is flipped on its head, and you, as the young, inexperienced person, inspire Heismay to undergo his transformative change. This, of course, is the most significant relationship Heismay develops, and the protagonist happens to be the same age as his late son. This dynamic sparks transformative growth in Heismay, leading him to refer to the protagonist as his star of hope. His paternal instincts, which were buried beneath years of grief, resurface, allowing him to reconnect with the world. Throughout his social link, Heismay tells you about his life, about lessons he's learned, and you work together to finally put his son to rest. Eventually, he decides to keep his son with him at his heart, and rather than spread his ashes in the traditional Ujif way, he asks Yufa to make him a necklace of his son's bones. First of all, shout out to Yufa for that, but second of all, I know that might sound kind of out of pocket, but please abandon logic for a moment and let's just think about the message. Heismay is basically committing here to accepting his grief over his son and forgiving himself for the years afterwards in which he lost his way. No matter what, he'll never forget the impact of his son on his life and the meaning of everything he went through. He's more motivated than ever to rid the world of its oppressive world state that caused his son's death. Heismay professes that your presence is what helped him undergo this transformation and ensures that you know he thinks of you as a son. It's beautiful stuff. I do believe Heismay also serves as a valuable thematic contrast to Luis, as they are both people shaped by tragedy who ended up joining the nation's military. They were also both framed for crimes that they didn't commit. Beyond that though, there's nothing too deep here, but I can appreciate that they set up their backstories with similar events to convey to us that the world itself is broken for such things to happen to all types of different people in it. Outside of that, I'd be remiss not to mention Basilio, who I touched on earlier, but the main reason this relationship is key for Heismay is it showcases his positive transformation throughout the game and capability to deprogram away from his racial biases against Parapets rooted from his son's death. Now, let's get into what I assume is most of y'all's favorite part.
No need for tears, lad. I myself am finally content for once. Thanks to you. We two have spoken of much, eh? Sometimes it's felt as though my son himself has been advising me. And well, I've been through no small pains on this endeavor. But it was that experience that brought me to my decision. After all this, you are like a son to me yourself, you know. Your life, your ideals. I will protect them as my own. Another toast then. To us. To my son. And to the children. And their future.
So, Heismay's hidden symbolism is a bit more straightforward than some of the other characters we've covered. Simply put, his last name Noctul is actually a word for a bat that is common in Eurasia and North Africa. We can also look at Heismay's character design and be pretty confident in saying that the Yu-Chief design is based off of bats. Generally speaking, the imagery of bats are a universal symbol of rebirth. Let me explain why. Bats roost in caves, which have long been seen as gateways to the underworld or the womb of the earth. Their nightly emergence from caves represents a return to life, much like a rebirth. Another reason is that in many cultures, nighttime is linked to death, while morning signifies renewal. Since bats are nocturnal and disappear at dawn, they embody the cycle of death and rebirth. So, I believe knowing all of this, it was a very deliberate choice that Heismay's character and his arc within this game was what it was. I mean, damn. If you don't believe they drew a very deliberate parallel between Heismay and the symbolism of the bat, remember that you literally found him in a cave. And as we've discussed, Heismay is metaphorically reborn after meeting the protagonist and shedding his past despair and finding new purpose. We could also draw a parallel from Heismay's character to ancient Greek philosopher Plato's allegory of the cave. For those who are unfamiliar, I will try to explain what the allegory of the cave is in a compact way. Plato's allegory of the cave describes prisoners chained inside a dark cave who have never left the cave, and they're only able to see shadows cast on the wall by objects behind them. They mistake these shadows for reality. One prisoner is offered freedom and discovers the outside world, realizing the truth. When he returns to enlighten the others, they reject him. The allegory illustrates how perception is limited, true knowledge requires enlightenment, and people often resist new ideas that challenge their beliefs. I think this could be another reason that we find Heismay in that cave, to connect us to this allegory. In Heismay's scenario, it's almost like he self-imposes himself as one of the prisoners chained to the wall. So it's the reverse of the allegory. Heismay knows the outside world and was victim to the raw horrors of it. So he rejects it and chains himself and his mind and refuses to see anything else but the shadows on the wall. The shadows on the wall being his grief and self-wallowing. Eventually, you come into the cave and offer Heismay his freedom, just like one of the prisoners was freed in Plato's allegory of the cave. Atlus loves to layer double and triple meanings into their environmental storytelling, so I'm quite convinced that these parallels were intentional, and the evidence we went over reflects that as well. While it's not overly complex, Heismay's symbolism is succinct, and I genuinely appreciate how they went out of their way to have the character designed to look like a bat, also share in the symbolism that bats have in real life. The cave and connection to Plato's allegory was just icing on the cake. Awesome stuff.
I couldn't abide it. Reality was too painful, and I ran until I was spending my nights and days in the sandworm's pit. Better to live in solitude than in the embers of hell. That was the real reason I lived in that den of beasts. I thought death would be a mercy.
Heismay.
And then these meddlers came along. They dragged me under the night sky I'd not seen in many seasons. And beneath those stars, it finally came to me. This is not the life my son would have wanted for me. That thought changed my whole perspective. His memory deserves love, not pain.
Heismay's journey is one of painful reckoning and eventual renewal. He's proof that grief, no matter how deeply ingrained, does not have to be a permanent state. Through struggle, reflection, and the influence of others, even the most jaded souls can find a way, a path to redemption. Metaphor Refantatio uses Heismay not only as a vehicle for its themes of loss and identity, but also as a mirror for the player, challenging us to confront our own biases, our own pain, and our own capacity for change. And perhaps, like Heismay, we too can find our way forward and utilize empathy to pursue equitable ideals. Super quickly, I have a few really amazing updates for you all that I wouldn't have without the love and support you all have given me. Memberships are now live on the channel, so anyone who feels inclined can join up. You'll get access to some fun emojis to use in our comment sections in our Discord as well in the first tier. In the second membership tier, you gain access to a private channel where the future plans for the channel are discussed. In the long term, I hope that's a space where it's more of a partnership with you all in deciding what videos I pour everything into to create. In the highest tier, the last thing you can get is live time with myself. I love to game or just chat with you all. Monster Hunter just dropped and I'm a longtime hunter, but I'm also open to any multiplayer games, to be honest. Additionally, merch is now live for the channel. There are 4 separate designs and you can basically get your design on whatever you like, be that a mug, a shirt, a sweatshirt, or just stickers and magnets. But as always, there's no pressure whatsoever on any of this, guys. You being here and watching and sharing your thoughts will always be more than enough for me. And ultimately, even a subscription itself is something that I'm beyond grateful for. So all of this is just extra stuff and there's no pressure. As I'm sitting here right now recording for us, we're sitting right around 700 subscribers, which means there's almost 700 of us sitting in this room discussing video games. I see every single one of you and I thank every single one of you. As I always say, I'm just literally in awe. Never forget that you all are the main reason I make these videos, so whatever is going on in life, you are legitimately valued and appreciated here. I look forward to chatting with you all in the comments, and check out the other videos on my channel for more content like this, and have a great day, night, or morning, and remember to be kind and thoughtful. Peace.